Good afternoon. Oh, it's afternoon here. Good day to you wherever you're watching from. Today's video is a little bit delayed. I had an accident this morning. I fell and hurt myself pretty badly, so we needed some recovery time. So this is Croftalytical, and this is my kind of true crime commentary, I guess, and what we can learn from it. This is all about day 3 of the Alex Murdaugh trial. Bit of a recap, layperson recap. I am not a lawyer. I am not qualified in any associated professions or anything else like that. This is just a layperson going through what we've learned and what I've taken from it. So yesterday we started off with the cross-examination of criminalist Melinda Worley. She works in the labs, so she was responsible for collecting some of the evidence and processing some of the evidence. So we heard about shoe imprints and who she matched those to, which was Paul, one of the victims. The defense yesterday were all over the shop. They were, Harpootlian. I think I'm pronouncing his name right, and that is his real name. For the defense, came across as bumbling, underprepared, just incompetent yesterday. Lots of dead air, lots of pauses, asking questions and switching topic halfway through, or changing the question halfway through. Asking questions that he didn't know the answer to, which gave her a chance to kind of make him look daft, if I'm honest. And there was some debate in the chat on uncivil law about whether, because he's meant to be an amazing attorney, and this is him acting like he's bumbling, and there's going to be a gotcha moment. He's getting people to underestimate him, and then he's got this amazing thing, but it just came across as actual incompetence. And again, last week, I think it was Friday afternoon, he was admonished by the judge for his objections, objecting and then going straight into a diatribe about that objection, rather than waiting for the judge to to be in control of the proceedings. So again, he was admonished for speaking objections. The judge sent the jury out of the room to ask whether they needed more time, and basically tell them to get their stuff together, because they were badly organized. He gave them time to work out what evidence they were happy to be brought into the trial, and what they agreed with, what they disagreed with. It seemed like he had spent the weekend in bed and not done his homework over the weekend, not thought about how he was going to cross-examine the witness. Once that was dealt with, they then went through the crime scene, the 3D image of the crime scene, and angles and everything else. And he went on and on and on about angles, and what angle was this fragment hole, or this thing, or that thing, and was comparing that to her sketches, her calculations and everything else. And as Kurt Uncivil Law kept saying, and was getting really frustrated about it, we all were, the drawing's not to scale. So you cannot compare the measurements to the drawing, because they're not in scale to each other, which again just came across as incompetent. And all of his points were very easily refuted by the prosecution when they had redirect. It feels like the defense are nowhere. To be honest with you, neither side is doing a particularly great job, but they just feel like they're nowhere. They then, the prosecution then called Jeff Croft, who is a special agent, some kind of agent for SLED, which is South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. So he detailed what weaponry they found at the scene, in the house, in the hunting room, what ammunition they found, where it was found, what it relates to. Now, the ammunition doesn't really tell us anything, because it is all of the ammo is the most common ammo you can get. It's nothing about it stands out. They then had an objection from the defense about relevance. They went through all of the weapons that they retrieved and submitted into evidence, and they showed all of these weapons to the jury. They discussed them, everything else, and the defense objected and just went straight into the question of relevance. Now, again, they've been admonished for this. Instead of just saying objection, relevance, he gave this whole speech about why he felt it wasn't relevant. The judge then opened it up to the prosecution to, would you like to respond to that speaking objection? Love the snark. And of course, the prosecution said, well, they've opened the door. They've questioned the thoroughness of the investigation, the techniques used, how they eliminated or couldn't eliminate what the weapons were, and all of the rest of this stuff. We have a right to explain the process and show them all of these things. It goes to all of these things. It goes to their question on crime scene etiquette, basically, and the fact that they seem to be hinting at the fact that no one likes the family, and therefore their bias. So it was a really bad move on the part of the defense to object to it. Go at it in cross and attack it in cross. Isn't it true that all of these weapons came back as not matching, or, not recently fired, or whatever the forensic evidence tells you about those weapons? It felt like his first day on the job. And I know I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not in the courtroom, and I don't know the technicalities of this kind of thing. It came across as really badly thought out. So really, I mean, the guns and the ammo don't tell us much of anything on their own. And prosecution came out on ahead at lunchtime, but really, or by the end of the day rather, but it didn't sway the needle a huge amount. What I will say, and maybe this is a cultural difference between guns in the UK and guns in the States. Now, we do have guns here. You have to go through a very rigorous application and screening process, and we have very, very strict laws about kinds of guns, how they can be stored, where the ammo has to be in a different room, in a separate locked container, all of those things. But to me, as someone who has been around guns a little bit, it doesn't make sense that they would find weaponry on the wall loaded. It doesn't seem like good gun safety to me that you would keep weapons with ammunition in them easily accessible on the wall. There is also a lost or stolen gun that was owned by Paul, one of the victims, but it was never reported lost or stolen. Now, it turns out in South Carolina, you don't have to. There's no legal obligation to report it lost or stolen. But Alex Murdaugh was a prosecutor. you'd think he would report it, knowing... No, stop. Sorry about that. Knowing that guns can be found or stolen and used in crimes, and that's going to come back to you if you've bought it legally. So again, like, both sides, it's kind of a dud. We don't know where the evidence is going. We can make assumptions that they are going to say these guns were eliminated. However, this lost stolen gun, and it turns out there are two that are missing. One that was lost or stolen a few years before, and one that hasn't been retrieved, that everyone admits they owned. The 3 rifles were custom or were made for them by their cousin, who is also something to do with the police department. So yeah, evidence collecting. They've got shell casings from a private firing range, 17 in total, that are the same type as those used in the crime. I think where they're going with that is somehow tying those with the same gun that was used to commit at least one of the unalivings. But that's kind of as far as that went in terms of testimony. They then moved on to the second interview with Alex Murdaugh, and this was a few days after. The day before, they held a memorial service about a week before the funerals. And they went through his movements for the day of the crime, but it was very vague. It was very, very vague. There were no real certainties. You know, I got up, I had breakfast, I went to work. I was working on, we had a trial coming up, so I was working on that. And then, of course, I'm named in a civil suit about the boating accident. So I was kind of working on that. I left work a little bit early. What time was that? Well, I left work a little bit early. Like, there were no exacts. He says that, and as he's talking, a couple of things that stood out to me. As he's talking, he's very matter of fact. He mentions, you know, finding the scene and breaks down. That's normal. Easily triggered, came on really quickly. However, when they ask him in the next question, it stops completely. And that tickled the back of my brain. I'm not saying one way or the other, but it tickled the back of my brain as something that didn't feel right. He also talks about Maggie in the past tense, his wife that passed away, in the past tense consistently. When he talks about Paul, he talks about him in the past and present tense. So that to me is very interesting. Most people slip up and use the present tense for someone who has recently passed away. So that, again, tickled the back of my brain. There was a discussion about Paul being secretive with his phone, possible outside motives and suspects. The last time he saw Maggie and Paul, now this was interesting because this was new information to me, because I've deliberately tried to keep myself as neutral as possible. The last time he saw them was at supper. He then sat down to watch TV and fell asleep. When he woke up, no one was around. He texted Maggie, got no reply, and went to his mum's house to check on her. And again, there weren't a lot of details there. So, you know, I'm waiting to hear time of death and that kind of thing, because that, I find that fishy. Again, I've got a tickle. He then went on to ask for updates about the investigation, and to be kept in the loop. asked them if they had any suspects, asked them if they had any good evidence. And although he was cooperating and everything else, that was a large part of what he was saying, is he wanted to be kept in the loop. He asked law enforcement to keep his in-laws in the loop. It would make them feel better, that kind of thing. They're good people, lots of high praise for them. So, and again, when he's talking, I mean, he spoke about his wife, the fact that she was a really great mother, and she didn't work, and because she wanted to be a homemaker, it was really important to them and everything else. But he was far more full of praise for her parents and her sister and other people. And that could be distancing behavior in from either side. So it could be that he's distancing himself because he isn't ready to talk about Maggie in those terms, that it's too painful because he lost his soulmate or whatever else. It could be that he's distancing himself from Maggie because of his actions. It's not that I'm reading anything into it, but all of these things are, you know, they're noteworthy for me. The psychology of it, the human behavior of it. The officers then told Alex Murdaugh to get himself and Buster, the surviving son, counselling. They discussed the memorial service and the funeral. They then took things like buccal swabs from him and a chap called Rogan Gibson, who they've spoken about before, but I can't remember his connection. So I need to go back and check that. So the court has adjourned. For me, we're edging so slowly towards moments of, okay, this is why the prosecution have tied these things together. You know, we compared spent shell casings, and we found that firing pin or, you know, ejection marks were consistent between the firing range and the gun used to commit the crime, or something, or fingerprints, or whatever it might be. But for me, because they're jumping between, right, you collected these things and then you spoke to Alex, they're following the timeline rather than following a piece of evidence to its conclusion. And I'm finding that difficult. You know, okay, we've talked about the guns. So what does that mean? Where do they fit into the into this story? Because neither side has given that narrative. Neither side has given any kind of, this is what we think happened and this is why. And as I discussed in the last video, there was, you know, there wasn't that start big moment from either side. They're both very slow. And maybe this is a Southern thing, maybe it's a cultural thing, but for me, it's not working for me. As a theoretical jury member, I'm nowhere. I've got these notes about evidence, but I've got nothing else. I've got no conclusions or, you know, where this fits into the real timeline of what happened that day or whatever else. So the reasonable doubt is still there. There are some things that are tickling the back of my brain, but the doubt is there because for the timeline that they've got, Alex Murdaugh would have only had 17 minutes to commit both unalivings, get himself cleaned up and changed, and in the car to get to his mum's. That's not a long period of time, especially for something as messy as that crime scene, and for how big the property is. So that's a moment. There's no clothing. We've already established that there's no clothing that ties him to the scene as the perpetrator, and there's no weapons. They have one weapon, they don't have both. And there are still plenty of outside motives. if we're going to throw around kind of theories, and these are theories, he was not a well-liked person. He is named in the boating accident, which was a big deal locally. And there's lots of animosity there. His son obviously was involved in the boating accident. He's got 106 counts of fraud and fraud-related charges where clients lost $10 million. That's a lot of people, a lot of families, friends, or even someone locally that may have taken matters into their own hands. So nothing at the moment is discounting those outside motives, but nothing is discounting Alex Murdaugh and his and his connection. 17 minutes, not a long amount of time, but theoretically possible. And is it really 17 minutes? If he woke up from his nap and Maggie wasn't around, could it have been earlier? I am really looking forward to hearing from, looking forward to is the wrong word, because, we're going to hear graphic details about autopsies, but I'd like to see those conclusions from the medical examiner: time of death, cause of death, the exact cause of death. Obviously, we know the overarching thing. Is there leeway in that timeline? Also, the technology data. When did his phone ping and at what time? Those missed phone calls he made to friends, family, whoever, does that tie in with when he could have theoretically committed the crime? So there's lots there. Still more questions than answers by a long way. And, I'm not there yet. My needle is still towards not guilty because there's far too much reasonable doubt. It could swing the other way pretty violently, depending on what comes out over the next couple of days. So today starts with the defense cross-examining Jeff Croft about the ballistics and collection of evidence and that kind of thing, and the interview. One thing I will mention about the interview, during the interview, with the second interview, Alex Murdaugh, in describing the scene with finding his son Paul, he said something along the lines of, "I did him bad," or "they did him bad." It's hard to tell. And a lot of people are like, it's a confession. I'm not sure. That could relate to the fact that there were threats against Paul and they weren't taken seriously, or they were taken seriously, but they didn't really do anything about it. Or he could have done more to protect Paul, or any number of reasonable explanations. So the other thing I'm interested to find out is there a psychological evaluation? Did the police or the prosecution or the defense get a psych eval done? Are there any diagnoses from that? Because trauma can affect our memories. Our brains protect ourselves. So are there inconsistencies in his story, not because he's making stuff up, but because he genuinely believes he tried to roll over Paul, or that he did or did not touch his wife, or whatever else? Because that kind of thing, I don't think people can really understand how traumatic a scene like that would be, whether you're a perpetrator or not. It's a lot harder than people think to take a life, and the shock of having done it is the thing that a lot of people who have empathy that aren't psychopaths talk about. So, I'm interested in that side of things as well. Hopefully we'll get a little bit further on from the evidence that we've talked about so far and talk a little bit more about the story. No one has talked about motives. No one has offered names or people that could be other suspects at this time. Who knows? I will be watching today on uncivil law. I will put a link in the description for the channel. Go along, let Kurt know in the chat that I sent you and that we're all supporting him. If you have any questions, if there's anything you would like me to talk about in these recaps, pop it in a comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts are so far as well. I've really enjoyed reading those. But if you're enjoying my recap and you want to hear more, hit like and hit subscribe so that you get notified when I do another video tomorrow.